In the golden age of Hollywood, no star burned brighter or fell harder than Errol Flynn. The swashbuckling hero who conquered screens and hearts alike seemed invincibly until one dark chapter emerged from the shadows. What happened behind the glittering facade would not only destroy a legend, but forever change how Hollywood protected its secrets. This is the untold story of the scandal that brought down cinema's greatest rebel. Before the scandal that would define his legacy, Errol Flynn was Hollywood royalty incarnate. Born in Tasmania in 1909, Flynn possessed that rare combination of rugged masculinity and aristocratic charm that would make him the template for every leading man who followed. His piercing eyes and devil-maker smile promised adventure, and audiences couldn't get enough. By 1935, Flynn had captured America's imagination in Captain Blood, his breakout role alongside Olivia de Havilland. The chemistry was electric, the swashbuckling authentic, and Hollywood had found its new king. Studio executives at Warner Brothers knew they had struck gold. Flynn wasn't just an actor, he was a fantasy made flesh, embodiment of masculine adventure that audiences desperately craved. But beneath the carefully crafted image lay a man whose appetites were as legendary as his performances. Flynn's off-screen reputation for excess was whispered about in Hollywood circles long before it became front-page news. The parties at his Mulholland Drive mansion were notorious wild affairs where bourbon flowed like water and moral boundaries seemed to dissolve into the California night. Those who knew Flynn intimately understood that his public persona wasn't entirely fabricated. He lived with the same reckless abandon that he brought to his roles, whether piloting his yacht Sirocco through dangerous waters or engaging in legendary bar fights. Flynn seemed determined to prove that Errol Flynn, the man, was every bit as daring as the characters he portrayed on screen. Little did anyone realize that this very quality, this refusal to conform to Hollywood's carefully managed image, would ultimately become his undoing. The warning signs were there for those who cared to look. Flynn's drinking was becoming legendary even by Hollywood standards, and his womanizing had reached almost mythical proportions. But in 1941, none of that mattered. He was untouchable, beloved, and seemingly invincible. The scandal that would destroy everything was still lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The Errol Flynn that Hollywood presented to the world was a carefully constructed myth, but the man behind the myth was far more complex and dangerous than anyone suspected. At his sprawling Mulholland Drive estate, Flynn entertained with a lavishness that bordered on decadence. The parties were legendary, but they were also breeding grounds for the very scandal that would eventually consume him. Flynn's mansion wasn't just a home, it was a playground for the privileged and morally flexible. The guest list read like a who's who of Hollywood's elite, but it also included names that would later prove problematic. Young hopefuls, aspiring actresses, and society girls all found their way to Flynn's door, drawn by the promise of glamour and the intoxicating presence of a genuine movie star. What happened behind those doors would later become the subject of intense speculation and legal scrutiny. Flynn's parties were notorious for their anything-goes atmosphere. Alcohol flowed freely, inhibitions disappeared, and moral boundaries became increasingly blurred. The host himself was often the center of attention, regaling guests with tales of his adventures, while his piercing blue eyes sought out the evening's most attractive female companions. Those who attended these gatherings would later describe an atmosphere of barely controlled hedonism. Flynn seemed to operate by his own rules, confident that his star power would protect him from any consequences. He was wrong, but that realization was still months away. For now, he was living the fantasy that millions of men envied: a life without limits, without consequences, and without the moral constraints that bound ordinary mortals. The irony wasn't lost on those who knew Flynn well. The man who portrayed heroes on screen was becoming increasingly unheroic in his personal life. The disconnect between image and reality was growing wider with each passing day, setting the stage for a fall that would be as spectacular as his rise to fame. The call came on a crisp October morning in 1942. Shattering the carefully maintained silence that had protected Errol Flynn for so long. Two young women, barely out of their teens, had come forward with accusations that would rock Hollywood to its very foundation. Betty Hansen, just 17, and Peggy Satterley, only 15, claimed that the screen's greatest swashbuckler had committed statutory rape. The news hit Hollywood like a seismic shock. Flynn, who had seemed untouchable just days before, suddenly found himself facing the most serious charges imaginable. The studio system that had built him up now scrambled to distance themselves from their fallen star. Warner Brothers executives, who had once boasted about their prized possession, now spoke in hushed tones about damage control and crisis management. The details of the accusations were devastating. Both young women painted a picture of Flynn as a predator who used his star power to lure them into compromising situations. According to their testimonies, Flynn had invited them to parties at his Mulholland Drive estate and aboard his yacht where he allegedly assaulted them. The stories were detailed, disturbing, and seemingly credible. For Flynn, the accusations came as a thunderbolt from a clear sky. He had always lived dangerously, But this was different. This threatened not just his career, but his freedom. The man who had portrayed noble heroes was now cast as a villain in the most sordid kind of real-life drama. His immediate response was predictable complete denial. Flynn claimed innocence, insisting that he was being framed by opportunistic young women seeking fame and fortune. But the damage was immediate and severe. Headlines screamed across the nation, and Flynn's name became synonymous with scandal rather than adventure. The court of public opinion had already begun to render its verdict, and it wasn't favorable to the fallen star. The golden age of Hollywood was about to confront its darkest hour through the prism of one man's spectacular downfall. When Errol Flynn walked into the Los Angeles courthouse in January 1943, he carried with him not just his own fate, but the reputation of an entire industry. The trial that followed would become one of the most sensational legal proceedings in Hollywood history. A circus of celebrity, scandal, and sensationalism that captivated the nation during the darkest days of World War II. The prosecution's case seemed airtight. They presented to young victims whose testimonies painted Flynn as a sexual predator who used his fame and charm to exploit vulnerable teenagers. Betty Hansen took the stand first, her voice trembling as she described alleged assaults that had occurred at Flynn's mansion. Her testimony was detailed, emotional, and devastating. Peggy Satterley followed, recounting similar experiences aboard Flynn's yacht, the Sirocco. But Flynn's defense team, led by the legendary Jerry Giesler, was prepared for war. Giesler was known as the attorney to the stars, a man who specialized in defending celebrities when their carefully crafted images crumbled. He immediately began attacking the credibility of the accusers, painting them as opportunistic gold diggers who saw Flynn as their ticket to fame and fortune. The courtroom drama was unlike anything Hollywood had ever seen. Flynn himself cut a tragic figure, still handsome, still charismatic, but now haunted by the specter of his own destruction. He maintained his innocence with the same conviction he had once brought to his heroic roles. But observers could see the strain in his eyes, the weight of knowing that everything he had built was hanging in the balance. As the trial progressed, it became clear that this was about more than just Errol Flynn. This was Hollywood on trial, its moral authority questioned, its protective bubble punctured. The industry that had presented itself as wholesome family entertainment was being exposed as something far more complicated and potentially corrupt. The stakes couldn't have been higher for everyone involved. Jerry Giesler knew that defending Errol Flynn would require more than legal expertise. It would demand a complete reconstruction of reality itself. The legendary attorney had built his reputation on saving Hollywood careers, but Flynn's case presented unique challenges. The accusations were serious, the evidence compelling, and public sentiment was rapidly turning against his client. But Giesler had a strategy that would shock America with its boldness. Rather than simply denying the charges, Giesler chose to attack the very character of the accusers themselves. In an era when women's testimony in sexual assault cases was routinely questioned, he masterfully exploited societal prejudices and double standards. Betty Hansen, he argued, was no innocent victim but a calculating opportunist who had pursued Flynn relentlessly. He painted her as sexually experienced and manipulative, someone who understood exactly what she was doing. When she entered Flynn's world, the strategy was ruthless and effective. Giesler brought forth witnesses who testified to Hansen's allegedly promiscuous behavior, suggesting that she had actively sought out relationships with older men. He portrayed her not as a victim but as a predator, herself a young woman who used her sexuality to gain access to Hollywood's elite circles. With Peggy Giesler employed a different but equally